When we last left off, I was going through my top 15 episodes of Hunter x Hunter. In that list, I specifically left off one episode because I thought explaining its placement would simply take too long. So that's what this video today will be addressing. The second best episode of Hunter x Hunter, which I think is the one where the Phantom Troop shoots up the gallery. I know some of you out there are probably thinking, what, really? Yes, really. It may surprise some of you to learn that this was actually a pixel away from being my number one pick. Why? It doesn't have the best animation, there are certainly episodes which have better dialogue or a better story, and within the context of this arc, there are episodes which are certainly more climactic. Hell, this episode doesn't even have Gon, Killua, or Leorio. Kurapika, the protagonist of this arc, is barely in it. So why? Since I think this one will require a lot of justification, let's quickly give a rundown of the events of this episode, somewhat in depth. At the underground auction, Kurapika stands outside with half the bodyguards, watching the location from afar. 4 minutes in, Phaeton tells the auction house they're skipping formalities, and Franklin proceeds to shoot every guest in the room. A pool of blood is left, and 3 of the characters we just antiquated with are dead, each with graphic and horrible head trauma. As the mob tries to discern what happened inside, our gang of villains escapes on an air balloon. Chrollo and Uvo have a fantastic conversation about a traitor in their midst, and then Chrollo gives the troop permission to let loose against the mob. Uvo goes to town. He catches a bullet with his teeth, twists a dude's neck off, and crushes his face. Other noteworthy feats of Uvo in this scene include throwing a rock between someone's eyes and taking a bazooka to the face. As Uvo annihilates competition, other members of the troop play cards. So, what exactly makes this episode so noteworthy? To me, there is one big thing this episode accomplishes, something many other films and TV series have tried but often fail at. A stark shift in tone. In general, shifting tone can be very difficult. When your audience is accustomed to your series feeling a certain way, pivoting and trying to make your show feel different can be met with apprehension and distaste. But that is not to say it's something which is unheard of. In particular, I can think of one example off the top of my head which accomplished a shift in tone very well. Avatar: The Last Airbender is perhaps one of the most notable examples of how a show can mature with its characters. Although the show starts primarily as a goofy, whimsical adventure series, by the end, much of the goofy humor has dissipated. This is due in part to both how the events within the plot are consistently much more serious, and how the characters themselves matured beyond their childish roots. In other words, as the characters become of age, so does the show. This is not to say that the show is humorless by the end, or unserious in the beginning, but on the whole, the series experiences a gradual shift in tone that feels natural with the characters' slow progression towards adulthood. But Hunter x Hunter is distinctly different in that it does not shift tone gradually. Hunter x Hunter shifts tone fast, and in order to accomplish that, there is a lot of setup and forethought put into the presentation. In particular, from the beginning, Hunter x Hunter was always full of violence and dark moments. However, it was not until this episode that Togashi decided to marry the two in such an extreme way to shift the series' tone to something far grimmer. Put simply, he kept the violence and darkness largely separate and subdued, so that when this moment happened, it would feel in line with the rules of the show, while still being something far beyond the story up to this point. Let's start our discussion with the violence. Hunter x Hunter was always violent. Killua ripping out a man's still beating heart comes to mind as the most obvious moment, but even setting that moment aside, this show was always filled to the brim with brutality. The major difference is that the violence was often done in ways to minimize its severity. The Hunter exam is the best illustration of this. The deaths in Stage 2 and 3 of the Hunter exam have this cartoony element to them. Yes, at least 4 people get impaled on screen by spikes, but notice how there isn't even a drop of blood. And as with everyone else who dies during these stages, we cut away quickly and don't dwell on it. Stage 5 escalates slightly with marginal amounts of blood, but the majority of fatal blows are still left off screen. Appropriately, the most violent moment in this arc occurs when Killua stabs Botaro, and while it is a bloody image that stands in contrast to the rest of the exam, it still doesn't feel like that huge of a leap from the previous violence, nor in the same ballpark as the shooting in York New City. Yet, this acts as a primer to separate the audience for what comes later, a way to keep violence in the story while maintaining a fun atmosphere. A little foreplay before the big act, if you will. Yeah, I guess that's staying in. Why not? The biggest distinction you can say about the violence in the Hunter exam is that while it may be just as gruesome when you stop to think about it, the show never treats it as such. In this arc, we more often blow past the images of corpses rather than lingering on their horrific state. All of this lets the audience walk away from the Hunter exam with the impression that it's fun, and causes them to neglect the greater violence at play. For now. So now that we have addressed our violent yang, let's talk about the darker yin. While the early part of Hunter x Hunter is generally a lighthearted adventure, in retrospect, there was always darkness lurking in the background. The audience can be forgiven for not noticing this on a first watch, as sometimes it is played for laughs and other times it exists on implication, but nonetheless, it is still there. The first dark moment of note to mind is Killua's torture by the Zoldyck family. As he stands bound in chains covered in scars, at first the audience is meant to be repulsed. Until it's turned into a punchline when Killua casually lets himself go and complains about the pain as if he just stubbed his toe. The next darkest moment of note is the existence of the Nen-ravaged people of Floor 200. When you stop to think about how sudden and undeserved this fate was upon these three, it is horribly depressing and tragic. But the show does well to make sure you won't be thinking too sympathetically about it. These three are written to be predatory villains, attempting all sorts of sadistic trickery on our heroes, making it hard to be empathetic for them, despite their new disabilities. What should be noted is neither of these two aforementioned moments are particularly violent. We never see the Nen blast that leaves these three goons of Heaven's Arena in a sorry state, and Killua's torture is mostly carried out off-screen. While it may be pushing the limits, it wouldn't be impossible to put either of these scenes or elements into a children's show. Again, while the story and world may have always been disturbed, the show blows past these elements so that you don't dwell on it. Even when the dark moments are violent, something happens to undercut that tone, or it is quickly brushed aside. For example, right after Killua rips out a man's still beating heart, which, mind you, is probably the most dark and violent moment in the series prior to Season 3, Killua and Gon just go play in the penalty room like normal children would. And the whole incident is brushed aside without consequence. When Killua kills Botaro, we see it as the end of a flashback and immediately jump to the present, where the incident has been wiped clean. In this way, neither of these moments linger too long, and they leave the false impression that the events of Hunter x Hunter don't stray too far from a jovial tale of wonder. The whole time, our leads remain as bright and cheerful as ever. Except in the case of one character, where things are played a little more serious. Kurapika. Something I haven't even mentioned yet. While it is extremely impressive the show shifts tone quickly here, what might be arguably more impressive is how after this arc, it switches back. Greed Island is probably the most lighthearted arc in the entire series, and it comes after one of the most violent and dark arcs in the story. So how exactly does that feel natural or work? Well, it's because of one thing. In York New City, Killua and Gon are written into the background as Kurapika takes center stage. Neither of the two main leads are witnesses to the worst acts of violence in York New. In this way, Gon can maintain his naivety and childish innocence in Greed Island that would otherwise feel impossible if he was with Kurapika during the shooting, stood over Uvo during his death, or were present for the troops' revenge on the Mafia. For this arc, Kurapika is the one who grows darker with the story, and since he's written out of Greed Island, that arc can proceed with sunshine and rainbows. In fact, the moments of levity in this arc stem, surprise surprise, primarily out of these two characters, allowing the story to slowly be more lighthearted and take us to a happier place on Greed Island. So how does this all come together? Let's see. So we've been primed to know that this show is at least capable of extreme violence, and there's been a handful of moments prior to this that are dark separate from a violent context. Killua and importantly Gon have been removed from this scene so they can maintain their cheerfulness in the next arc. For 2 seasons, the troupe has been adequately alluded to as ruthless killers. We know they do not value the lives of the innocent, and we know they are extremely powerful. We also know they're planning a heist, but know no details of the plan. All of this combined makes their plan to shoot up the gallery believable and in accordance with their ethos, while still shocking. With that, all the pieces are in place. All that remains is for the troupe to marry the two separate components, the extreme violence and a darker tone, and voila, we've created one of the most morbid and startling episodes in the entire series, while still conforming to the rules set up before. It's shocking, but not jarring. Obvious, but surprising. Darker and more violent, but strangely appropriate. And that, my friends, is really difficult to pull off. And it's why I think A Shocking Tragedy is the second best episode of Hunter x Hunter. Thanks for watching, everybody, and be sure to subscribe and tune in next week for the third part of Hunter x Hunter Month.